Hello, everyone. Let's discuss ability grouping today. If we talk about this particular topic, this comes under the heading of in school factors, social class, and educational attainment. Now, when we talk about ability grouping, what exactly is ability grouping? Ability grouping is the practice. It's the practice of organizing students. When you're organizing students into different groups or different classes on their perceived academic ability in specific subjects. So, in a nutshell, if we talk about ability grouping, we're talking about putting students into different groups or different classes, typifying students, categorizing students, labeling students into different categories on the basis of their perceived ability in specific subjects. Now, when we talk about ability grouping, we should be familiar with these terms: streaming, setting, banding, and mixed ability. To begin with, if we speak about streaming, what does the word streaming over here mean? When we use the word streaming, streaming refers to placement of students in the same ability groups for all subjects. Now, when you're placing students into a particular group for all the subjects that they're taking, we refer to that as streaming. Now, how is streaming different from setting? When we talk about a comparison between streaming and setting, setting on the other hand has to do with grouping students by ability in specific subjects. Understand the difference over here. For streaming it is for all subjects, for setting it is for specific subjects, while mixing abilities for other lessons. Now, for instance, if there's a student who is not doing well in mathematics, so you'd place that student in a set that would have less of load on that particular student for mathematics as a subject alone. Now, once we know the difference between streaming and setting, let's move on and talk about banding. Banding is not based on students' overall ability. This is more common in larger schools trying to fit students according to the timetable. Now, for instance, if there's a particular school or a college where there are, let's just say, 150 students for A2 sociology, when you are putting students or when you're placing students into different groups because there are a lot of students and you want to accommodate them all according to the timetables, we use the word banding for that. So, taking this ahead, if we talk about mixed ability, what does the word mixed ability over here mean? Mixed ability, or in other words, students of all ability are taught together rather than grouping based on their academic performance. Now, mixed ability is the one that is different from all three of them. Typically, when we talk about ability grouping, we usually refer to setting or we refer to streaming. There's a reference if you would want to put to use this reference by Ayerson and Hallam. Students are randomly or intentionally mixed in terms of their perceived ability. Now, this mixed ability is found in Finland, in China, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and many other countries too. Taking this ahead, if we speak about the relationship between ability grouping, social class, and attainment. Ability grouping, social class, and attainment. There was a study that was conducted by Joe Bowler. Joe Bowler conducted a study in 2005. Now, about this particular study, if we talk about this study had to do with the selection of students for different ability groups on the basis of the social class. Now, as the name over here, as the title over here suggests, we're talking about the extent to which an individual's social class affects his or her chances of being put into a particular ability group and not other. So, what sort of relationship does your social class have when it comes to your placement into a particular ability group, and what sort of effect does would it have on in terms of your attainment? Now, this particular study by Bowler in the year 2005 was conducted on 13 to 16-year-old students. These students were taking mathematics classes, and these students were picked from two different schools in Britain. I hope that's clear. If we talk about the overview of this particular study, students were selected for different ability groups on the basis of their social class. For instance, if we talk about the middle class, it was seen that middle class students were placed in higher sets and the working class students were placed in lower sets. And if we talk about the findings here, it Now, the findings over here have to do with attainment. Remember, we're talking about the relationship between your social class. Based on your social class, what ability group were you placed in, and what sort of effect did it have on your educational attainment? Now, talking about the findings over here, examination results showed that most of the higher grades were attained by middle class students, and most lower grades were attained by working class students. So, what do we conclude from this? We conclude that this placement of students into different ability groups on the basis of the social class they belong to eventually ends up affecting their educational attainment. So as we conclude this, ability grouping reproduces social class inequalities. Of course, it is reproducing social class inequalities when you're placing students into different ability groups based on your perception, based on the perception you hold about their abilities, and which, of course, in this case that Bowler showed had a lot to do with the social class they belong to. Because you see, middle class students, it was seen they were placed in higher sets, and working class students were placed in the lower sets. So, as we conclude this, ability grouping reproduces social class inequalities rather than promoting high achievement for all. Now, the entire idea behind ability grouping, behind placing students into different streams, different sets, was to accommodate students, to accommodate low achievers and help them do better than before. However, as a result of, as the study suggests, it was not true at all. The study shows that instead of bringing social class inequalities to an end, this placement of students into different ability groups eventually, consequently, was leading to the reproduction of social class inequalities. Taking this ahead, we've spoken about different sets over here. Moving on, let's talk about streaming. Now, as we speak about streaming over here, if we speak about streaming in primary school, there was this study by the Center for Longitudinal Studies. This is a relatively recent one from 2014. Now, according to this longitudinal millennium cohort study, there were 2,544 students that were studied, that were examined, and these were year two pupils. That is, their age ranged from 6 to 7 years, and these were students who were born in 2000 and 2001. If we have a look at the findings over here, streaming in primary schools increases the gap between high and lower attainment. So, what we're talking about is a situation where if students are placed into a higher stream when they're young, as they grow older, their educational attainment chances increase. However, on the other hand, if you're talking about a student who at a very young age is placed into a lower stream, as they grow older, the chances of their attainment reduce. That is, they end up attaining less as compared to the students who were placed into higher streams. Now, concluding this, working class students tended to be placed in lower streams, which eventually led to lower attainment, which was consequently widening the social class differences. Now, we were discussing ability grouping over here. While discussing ability grouping, we initially spoke about the relationship between your ability group, your social class, and your educational attainment, where we discussed the study that was conducted by Joe Bowler. And number two, we spoke about streaming, and streaming specifically in primary schools, where we had a research that was conducted by the longitudinal millennium cohort study. Now, let's have a look at where we could possibly put this reference to use. If we talk about this particular question that we had in October, November 2002, this particular question that we had in October, November 2002, if we read the question over here says, the statement over here rather says, pupil attainment is determined by factors outside of school. Pupil attainment is determined by factors outside of school. Using sociological material, give two arguments against this view. So, if you have to give two sociological arguments against this view, you could write down about the effects of streaming, you could write down about the effects of setting, and you could refer to the study that was conducted by Joe Ball over here. Another 26-mark question that I'd want to show you where you could possibly put Joe Poller's reference to use. This question that we had in May, June 2022, the question over here reads, evaluate the view that ethnicity is the most important influence on educational attainment. So, ethnicity being the most important attainment over here, if I squeeze this a little, we talk about the against side of the argument. You could always use Joe Bowler's reference for this particular question. Taking this a little ahead, There was a study, another research that was conducted by Hallam and Parsons in 2014. According to this, if we have a look at this, this is about grouping children by ability, changing teachers' expectations. How is it that the expectations teachers hold from students are affected by the ability group they belong to? We are talking about how teachers' expectations about students get affected. What do teachers think about those students depending on the ability group they belong to? This research over here was conducted by Hallam and Parsons. Now, if you talk about a teacher, if you talk about a teacher's point of view, what needs to be taught to a student, how it needs to be taught to a student, even the unspoken messages that are given to students or the pupils, they're affected by the ability group that they have been placed into, according to Hallam and Parsons. Taking this ahead, if we talk about the insight into effects of setting globally, if we talk about a research that caters to or that has data from the United Kingdom, the USA, Germany, Belgium, South Africa, Japan, and Australia. So we're talking about an insight into the effects of setting, or in other words, what effect does setting have on the educational attainment of pupils? According to Adam Gamoron in 2010, who examined effects of setting in different countries that I just named, higher set students gain more and lower set students lose more. If we talk about the overall effects on schools, it shows that despite of the higher gains of the higher set students, the losses of the results from lower set students did not leave a very favorable outcome of ability grouping. Now, when we talk about ability grouping overall, the idea is that if you're placing students into different ability groups, this would consequently, as overall this is going to help students this overall this is going to help students overall this is going to help students do better than before. But even if you talk about the gains that we have from ability grouping or placing students into different ability groups, the losses are a lot more. So if you talk about an overall or a holistic, if you try to get a holistic idea of this entire philosophy of ability grouping, this doesn't really work out in and this doesn't really work out in a very favorable manner generally. Now, the third finding over here, as the students progress from primary to secondary schooling, this assignment in different sets leads to widening of attainment gap. In other words, if you're talking about students when they're young, if you're talking about a comparison over here, we're talking about students when they're young. So this is a child, this is another child, and they've been placed into different ability groups. As they grow older, and let's just say their difference in attainment is this much, right? It's this much, where this child on your left is being placed into a lower set, and the child on the right has been placed into a higher set. As these kids grow older, this gap over here keeps on widening. I mean, there's more of a gap over here. If you talk about this particular situation, the gap was less. If you talk about this particular situation, this gap further widens, or this gap further increases, where the children from the where the children from the lower sets, they end up underperforming as compared to the children from the higher sets who end up doing a lot better. So overall, setting tends to reinforce social inequality in the wider society. Now we're talking about the negative effects that setting could have. Remember, streaming, setting, banding, ability groups, they're all examples of ability grouping. So Gamaron has a possible solution to this. Let's have a look at the possible solution that Gamaron has. According to Gamaron, academic standards in lower sets can be raised using rewarding mechanisms. So the students who are in the lower sets, you could reward them, you could give them incentives that might as well push them towards working hard and succeeding in examination. Number two, mixed ability classes to be designed in a manner that the potential low achievers receive supplementary instructions. They receive some supplementary instruction, supplementary work or assignment to do so that they could be pushed to do better. So these were the two possible solutions that were suggested by Cameron. We were talking about the study that was conducted by Adam Cameron in the year 2010, and this was an examination of the overall effect of setting globally. Remember, there was data collected from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 countries. Now, I hope this was helpful. In the next lesson, we would be discussing pupil subcultures. Thank you.